In the 2000s, there have been two amazing stories about voting in the great state of Florida. One of those stories is very well known. The other one is barely known at all, but has just become really, really important. The first one was in the year 2000, when this happened. The nail-bitingly close race between Al Gore and George W. Bush resulted in the race being called and then uncalled, and then a cacophonous, disorganized, politicized, intimidated counting process was ultimately called off in what was considered to be one of the most anomalous and partisan U.S. Supreme Court decisions of the modern era. And so George W. Bush became the president-elect. And then a bunch of newspapers from Florida and nationally decided to commission a study. They hired a company to count all the votes that had been cast in that election in Florida. By then, it was more than a year after the fact, but the study showed that if you did count all the votes in Florida that year, Al Gore won, incidentally. But by then, it was 11 months into George W. Bush's presidency. In 2004, when President Bush ran for re-election against Senator John Kerry, Mr. Bush clearly won Florida. In fact, he won it handily. He won by 5 points. The electoral map of Florida that year looked like this. Pretty red, right? But then in 2008, the second amazing Florida voting story of the 2000s unfolded to much less national attention. And that story is that between the election in 2004 and the election in 2008, the Democratic Party figured out how to win Florida again. It showed on Election Day when the iconic swing state of Florida had swung decisively by almost 250,000 votes. There was no nail-biting about Florida in 2008. The state was called essentially as soon as the polls closed. Barack Obama had won the state and won it big. And mainly, the Democratic Party achieved that over time in the lead up to that election by registering a ton of people to vote in Florida. In Florida, in the run-up to the presidential election, Democrats registered more than twice as many new voters as Republicans did. The Democrats' registration edge over Republicans in Florida in 2008 was 660,000 people, up from 280,000 in 2006. By Election Day 2008, thanks to voter registration drives, there were 660,000 more Democrats registered to vote in Florida than Republicans. You want to know why it was not close in Florida in 2008? Look at this. Here's how first-time voters in 2008 in Florida cast their ballots. Newly registered first-time voters went for President Obama by a 19-point margin. Clearly, this must be stopped. And so now the Republican legislature in the great state of Florida is fast-tracking a massive overhaul of Florida's elections laws. A massive overhaul that would make voter registration drives difficult to impossible to carry out in that state. No more new voters. Not with those kind of results. Republicans can't afford it. If you want to get people registered to vote in Florida right now, you can do so without much hullabaloo. This is what the League of Women Voters does. It's what church groups do. It's what Cub Scouts do. It's what college students do. It's an accessible across-the-board civic activity like it always has been. Register to vote. Register in either party. Register as an independent. Does not matter. But register. Voter registration drives. If you want to do a voter registration drive, you just pick up a stack of voter registration applications. Get your card table, set up outside the grocery store, let people fill them out, and then go turn them in. That's how it works now. Florida Republicans want to change the law, so if you want to register people to vote, if you want to even volunteer with a group that is registering people to vote, this means you, Timmy the Boy Scout, you're going to have to register with the state in advance. You have to register as a citizen deputy assistant voter registrar or something. I don't know what they're going to call it, but you have to register with the state in advance if you want to volunteer to work at voter registration drives under this Republican proposal that's moving through the Florida legislature. Also, you have to take part in some as yet unknown electronic voter information database upload system. Timmy. And if you don't get those voter registration forms submitted from the people you've gotten registered within 48 hours of the time they have signed them, not only are those voter registration forms automatically invalid, but you, Timmy the Cub Scout, you will be charged fines of at least $50 and up to $1,000 for each application you turn in past the 48-hour deadline. If you're Timmy's den chief, would you let his Boy Scout troop register voters with that hanging over your head? This seems to me to be designed to end voter registration drives in Florida. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, which is a nonpartisan organization that studies this stuff, community-based voter registration drives are particularly important for low-income citizens, students, young voters in other words, and minorities. Those are the people who tend to get registered at voter registration drives. So those are the people whose voter registration, Florida Republicans' new law, would have the effect of kiboshing on a large scale. Here's how those groups voted in 2008. Low-income Florida voters went for Barack Obama in 2008, 66% to McCain's 33%. Young Florida voters aged 18 to 24 voted for Mr. Obama, 60% to John McCain's 39%. Latinos in Florida voted for Mr. Obama, 57% to John McCain's 42%. Black voters in Florida went for Mr. Obama, 96% to John McCain's, is that right? Oh, yeah, 4%. If you are a Republican in Florida, wouldn't it be great to just be able to reduce the number of those people who are registered to vote, to reduce the number of people who get registered in that way by reducing the means by which they get registered? The Obama re-election campaign has posted online a new strategy video. They say it's their strategy for how they plan to win re-election for President Obama in this next election. They posted it online yesterday. President Obama's campaign manager is Jim Messina. You can see him there. In the video, he explains that the first priority, step one of what President Obama's campaign needs to do to win re-election in 2012, step one, what do they need to do first? Expand the electorate. Meaning register people to vote who aren't already registered. How are they going to do that in Florida? Joining us now is Adam Skaggs, Senior Counsel with the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. Adam, thanks very much for being here. It's nice to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Rachel.
Is it, I guess I'll just ask this bluntly, is it legal to make it this hard to register people to vote?
Well, I think if this bill passes the legislature and the governor signs it into law, we're going to find out, because I'm sure that this law will be challenged in court and we'll have a judicial decision. I will say this. When the Florida legislature first tried to pass a law along these lines in 2005, the Brennan Center, on behalf of the League of Women Voters and a number of other groups that register voters, challenged the law in federal court, and that law was struck down. In that case, the court found that it wasn't legal. It wasn't constitutional to impose these kind of restrictions on voter registration drives.
I know that the Brennan Center is not partisan. I know that you are not a partisan. But in terms of the parties here, their strategies, their motivations, if, as Mr. Obama's campaign manager said, the Democratic Party is counting on registering a ton of new voters again, presumably, particularly in swing states, in order to win, could you see a way for them to do that in Florida if this bill were law?
Well, it's certainly going to make it a lot harder. As you mentioned, this law would impose serious fines on groups if they fail to register, if they fail to turn in every single form within 48 hours. Groups like the Cub Scouts, like Timmy's Cub Scout group, and even groups like the League of Women Voters are going to have serious questions about whether they can comply with these onerous paperwork requirements and whether they can afford these fines. There may be large unions that may be able to absorb $1,000 worth of fines as part of the cost of doing business. But for community groups, student groups, school clubs, church groups, those kind of organizations simply can't afford $1,000 worth of fines. So they're going to often make the decision that they just can't do these kind of registration drives.
And again, the kinds of voters who are typically registered in drives like that are who?
Well, let me give you this statistic. African-American and Latino voters, voters from families whose first language is Spanish, are more than twice as likely to register to vote in these sorts of voter registration drives than white voters and voters who speak English as their native language. So it's exactly the groups you identified in the introduction to the piece who are going to be most prevented from voting by this sort of a law.
One of the other provisions in the, not in the state House version, but in the state Senate version of this Republican proposal in Florida, would quite dramatically shorten early voting in Florida. It would take it from 2 weeks down to about 1 week. Everybody on both sides seems to agree that that would pretty dramatically lengthen the lines at polling places on Election Day. Is there any evidence out there, anecdotal evidence or statistically sound evidence, about who that would most discourage from voting?
Well, it's going to have an impact across the board, obviously. It's going to, as you said, cut in half the opportunity to vote early. But if we look at the experience, take Ohio in 2004, where some of the worst issues with polling place lines are. These lines are frequently in urban areas. They're in less affluent neighborhoods. So the lines are going to grow in polling places associated with some of the same voters that often register to vote in these voter registration drives. So it's kind of a 1-2 punch that's going to suppress voting by these same communities. You know, and you mentioned in the introduction introduction that this is an effective strategy for preventing new voters from registering. Well, there's another nefarious part of this proposal in Florida, which is going further than that and saying, let's not stop just new voters, let's stop existing registered voters. This is a law which would make it impossible to change your address or change your name. For example, if a woman got married, to change her name and then cast a regular ballot. Florida, surprisingly perhaps, is actually one of the best states in the country in terms of voters who change their addresses. As law stands in Florida now, if you're registered to vote and you change your address before the next election, you can go to the polling place, sign an affidavit, give your new address, show an ID, as all Floridans have to do, a photo ID to make sure you're the same person and there's no risk of fraud, and you can cast a regular ballot and that ballot will count. Under this proposal, if you move outside a county, as students often do, as less affluent voters who don't own their houses but rent, and as more mobile parts of the population move, they will no longer be allowed to vote a regular ballot. They'll be forced to vote a provisional ballot. And as we know, sometimes they count, sometimes they don't.
In the last election, it was something like 48% of those got thrown out in Florida.
Exactly.
Adam Skaggs, Senior Counsel for the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. Thank you for helping us understand this. I feel significantly worse about it after talking to you than I did before. Thanks.
My pleasure.
It.